Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Digital Law News. My name is Laura Spencer, and I'm an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. I'm joined with my colleague Peter Wright today, and we're just going to run through some quick stories about some of the big news stories that have been coming up over the last couple of weeks. So I'll just pass over to Peter now to introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Thank you very much, Laura. So yeah, Peter Wright, Managing Director and Solicitor of Digital Law, and looking forward to doing a quick flick through some of the big stories this week. Some of them you might expect to hear, given one of them was one of the biggest news stories around the world this week. Others you may not have heard of, but are, I think, surprising nonetheless. So I'll pass back to you, Laura.
Absolutely. So yeah, the first thing we just wanted to quickly discuss today was Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram. So a lot of us probably have heard that or experienced yourself. So on Monday, I think it was for about 6 hours, there was downtime on both Facebook, Instagram and WhatsApp. So they're all owned by the same company, owned by Facebook, so all their services were down. And we just want to discuss a little bit how much of an impact that has on not only people talking to each other and socialising and interacting with the world, but also on businesses, particularly small businesses, micro businesses, and those in Asia and India as well, who are more heavily reliant on things like WhatsApp for the whole supply chain rather than just the initial advertising.
Indeed, thanks, Laura. Yes, the massive implications of the fact that these services went down for a period of approximately 6 hours all around the world. I think the first thing is that the whole premise behind Facebook is that it doesn't go down, and it is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So this is the first time in its entire operation that Facebook has ever sustained significant downtime or an outage of that type. And even though there were multiple fail-safes built into the system, on this occasion, what we understand or what they're saying was a fairly major upgrade ended up leading to such a calamitous network outage that it didn't just affect the Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp as a platform. Staff at their offices couldn't even get into the building to then rectify the problem. Literally everyone's key passes and everything suddenly didn't work either. So it just sort of showed the level of chaos that this caused and was a reason why it went on for quite as long as it did. And then, of course, there's the knock-on impact. An awful lot of smaller micro businesses that rely on Facebook for orders. You know, there are an awful lot of organizations that promote themselves heavily on Instagram, relying on photos. So you can think of everything from businesses dealing with, makeup and fashion through to food and hospitality. An awful lot of their business relies on great photos being posted on Instagram and people commenting on it and placing orders. Not to mention WhatsApp is often used to actually confirm customers' locations and set up deliveries. So the fact that all of those platforms went down has left, I think, a lot of people around the world suddenly thinking, oh, so it can go down. What if this happens again? Perhaps we need to make sure we have fail-safes available and alternatives, because if you're relying on that technology for your livelihood and then suddenly you're looking at potentially a day's worth of business being lost, that's not something you can really afford to lose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not just social media as well. It comes across like all technologies. So, for example, we have a case management system. If that went down, we know we could probably carry on our work by just using email to talk to clients or using our cloud backup. But having just one system in place and one operation business isn't always the best thing going.
Exactly. You never want to have all of your eggs in one basket. It's the old saying, and it still rings true. And I think this has really brought it home. And I think it's been a reminder that very often there are certain, I suppose, presences that we almost sort of take for granted online, and it's always been taken for granted that sort of Facebook will always be there. And I think when something like this happens, it's a reminder to users to think, do you really think all those hundreds or potentially thousands of photos that you have online that may document your life over the past couple of years, are they always going to be available? Is it actually worth actually making sure you download and have your own copy just in case for some reason it all goes down? it was offline for 6 hours this time. What if it goes down for 6 days or 6 months in future? You never know. And I think it's very often you speak to people who say, oh, you know, we use XYZ system, be it Amazon or Microsoft or Apple, and we rely on their cloud, and that's what we use. And this is a reminder that any system is not totally infallible. You can spend huge amounts on your infrastructure, as Facebook have done over the decades, and yet you can still have an outage like this. So no system, no matter what a chief executive or the senior leadership team may say, no system is ever entirely infallible. And this shows exactly what the consequences can be.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to the next story today then. So this is in regards to Twitch and the recent data leak that took part in the second half of September, I believe. So this is one of the world's top gaming platform for live streaming. And the top gamers have said to be earning about £5 million a year from filming themselves playing games online. So this information was leaked by the data leak, and since people have confirmed that this information is true. So yeah, there's a lot of saying that the top 80 players are making around £1 million a month each from doing Twitch alone. And this Twitch is actually owned by Amazon. So Amazon bought it in 2014, for about £970 million. And it now has around 30 million daily active users, with around 7 million people a day streaming their gaming to their fans.
Yeah, thanks. I found this a fascinating story because I think, first of all, it reminds us that it's interesting actually that this is one of the reasons that I think Facebook's market capitalization fell so much this week, is that this doesn't do their reputation any good, because we've seen in the last few years a lot of other platforms are hoovering up new, younger users, Twitch being one of them. And Twitch saw, I think it was, it's clearly been around for a few years, hence almost being worth almost $1 billion in 2014. It's now clearly worth an awful lot more than that. And it's, I think, also experienced a growth in popularity during the pandemic, when suddenly an awful lot of, in some instances, sports people, and I know Formula One drivers did this, that when they were suddenly no longer driving at circuits around the world, they started live streaming their virtual racing. So you could watch Lando Norris and Max Verstappen doing their online racing rather than being able to actually watch them in person at a Grand Prix. So that enabled them to still stay in touch with their fans and share their gaming skills as well. And clearly a lot of people are doing that, indeed 7 million at the last count, though it's then somewhat embarrassing when such a large platform that people rely on, again, ends up being compromised with a significant data leak here. And if we've got these figures coming out in terms of the number of daily active users, as well as information about those who are actually doing the streaming, and if we're looking at how much those people are earning, needless to say, this data leak probably reveals the amount that they are making from their streaming activity. So we're talking about people's financial information. It's probably things like sort codes and account numbers. There are those who pay licenses so they can access content, and that's where some of the money comes from, as well as advertising. And therefore, there's an awful lot of information wrapped up here that will have been breached. And it looks like, it's also a slightly, I think, worrying for those involved, when of course this looks like it's confidential files on a significant scale, detailing exactly how much some of those biggest stars are paid. And it looks as well like a lot of these figures date from 2019, so those figures may have changed again and increased even further during the pandemic. So I think a really significant breach in that it shows you can be a multi-billion-pound platform and you can still be targeted, and this data can still be lost. And I think it's a reminder to anyone using a platform which and various people over the course of the last 18 months to to make up for the fact that we couldn't go out in the real world, will have started using different platforms. And it just shows that if you are doing that and engaging in it on a significant way, buying or selling items, uploading financial information and lots of personal data, is just to think about the consequences. And it's similar to what we always say to our clients, which is basically, what's the worst that could happen?
Yeah, absolutely.
The best plan for the worst, but unfortunately you have to ask yourself, what happens if this data is lost? So, you know, and interestingly, just going back actually to that Facebook and WhatsApp breach that we talked about first of all, I did hear a few people saying that when they heard that WhatsApp had gone down, they thought, oh, good grief, what if it's been hacked? What if all of my WhatsApp messages ended up being available online? And for a lot of people, they end up saying things on WhatsApp, but they wouldn't end up saying, you know, talking about people, and they wouldn't necessarily like those comments to be broadcast far and wide.
No, absolutely not.
So it just kind of shows, you know, what's the worst that could happen? If you wouldn't like that information to be publicly shared, how about going through and deleting it?
Yeah. Yeah. I know WhatsApp are now introducing the similar to Snapchat, where they've got the messages that you can only display for a certain amount of time. So once the person's read it, it's deleted. So I suppose that's that one thing, but it's probably stored somewhere still.
Well, that's very perceptive. Because indeed it is still stored somewhere. It may disappear from the recipient's device, but that's still on a server somewhere. And indeed, some of these servers are not necessarily the most secure, but they can be retained for a long time. They aren't necessarily subject to particularly strong data protection laws, depending on the jurisdiction that they are based in, and you never know what could happen. So I saw one stand-up comedian saying, you know, there are different apps we could use here. What about the app that where it's unsuitable content, it automatically shares a copy of it with the person who sent its mother? That might stop them from sending things sometimes. And it just makes you think that, you know, perhaps really you shouldn't necessarily say or do anything online that you aren't comfortable with the idea of that being shared far and wide. And I think if people thought about that, we might not, have quite such a poisonous culture online sometimes on social media.
Yeah, absolutely.
We also might not end up, you know, saying things that don't really help the public discourse. But again, just always ask yourself that question: what's the worst that could happen? And when you think, oh, this could be breached, think, well, maybe not send that then, or perhaps get rid of that and don't say it after all.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to our third story today then. So this is the Weir Group, and they have been hit by a cyber attack, a ransomware attack. So the Weir Group are a mining equipment supplier, and they have suffered a ransomware attack, which has caused many of its systems to be shut down and has disrupted orders right into next year as well. So it's not clear how this ransom attack's happened, or if they have had their systems locked out, or whether they've paid any ransom. But what is clear is that this has had a big effect on their profits, which is about £40 million cut on their profits for this year. But saying that, it could have been a lot worse, because they are saying that their IT systems actually responded really well to this threat, with several of them isolating themselves and being shut down as well. And the chief executive, has actually come out and said that they responded really well and quickly and comprehensively to what was a sophisticated external attack on our business. So it's not clear what actually happened, or whether the ransomware attack was successful. But yeah, it definitely had a big effect on the company.
Yes, thanks, Phil. I mean, it's interesting here that the news has only really come out on this clearly because it's had an impact on the profitability of the business, and otherwise it looks like they would have kept news about this pretty quiet if they could have done. As it is, I think it's interesting that, I mean, we just talked about two issues affecting tech companies. Here we've got a mining company, but it shows that still it is a large organization which will still have large amounts of information online that it relies on to operate its systems, to process its orders. And if that then goes down, you are hamstrung, and you will then suffer potentially significant losses. Now, the big figure in the headline is the 40 million in terms of the loss of profit, but when it comes down to a cyber attack, you could be looking at having to report any loss of personal data to a regulator, You could be looking at civil liabilities from any affected data subject, be that staff, be it customers or other third parties. There can be a lot of attendant costs that will add on here, not to mention, for example, any new IT system and any new security that might be required. So I think 40 million is the tip of the iceberg, really. And I think that very often gets overlooked, and it's just showing that any organization can be vulnerable. It looks like they're trying to say, well, look, we did respond quickly. And on the face of it, they did, because I've heard of some organizations that were hit by ransomware, and when they didn't pay and then decided to get through and do a full system reset across a global corporation, that can take not just weeks, months until you're back up on your feet again. So if they responded quickly, that suggests their systems were pretty resilient, unless they did indeed succumb to temptation and just pay the ransom. Because if you paid it once, that suggests they'll probably come back and ask you for another ransom in the not too distant future. So it's not the best course of action there. But this just highlights that ongoing risk. Anyone can fall victim to this, and it can cause a lot of damage. And as I say, the 40 million it really is the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely. Just staying on the cyber attack topic then. So this is the NCSC weekly threat report. So the NCSC releases like a little document every week, and it usually has around 3 just little threats that people don't want to highlight to the public basically every single week. So this week's was published on the 1st of October, and the first story is talking about ransomware attacks against hospitals and the real life consequences they have. So I think a lot of people think when a ransomware attack happens, just the effect on the technology side and not necessarily what happens next. So we've just seen there that although the technology was affected, then they lost £40 million. And when it comes to hospitals, the technology is obviously affected, and then people end up dying more. There's delays with tests and procedures, increasing deaths, and people staying in the hospital for a lot longer. So yeah, just shows how big of an effect that a ransomware can have on a business or just an organisation or a governmental body as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to be. We're not looking at the nicest people in society here if it's putting things out there that could compromise hospitals and patient care at a time of a global pandemic is pretty low. I think it's worth highlighting, though, that sometimes with ransomware, it can be indiscriminate. If we look at the WannaCry ransomware in 2017, I think it was. I mean, that was just indiscriminate. That was just looking across the world for systems with vulnerabilities. So it took down everything from car manufacturing plants to some NHS trusts. And the point there is that it was just looking for systems that happened to be vulnerable. So, as is often the case, unfortunately, with hospitals, a lot of the money goes on care and isn't necessarily going on the world's most up-to-date IT. So if you've got an older unsupported version of Windows or Internet Explorer or Outlook, that could be vulnerable and allow the hackers to then get in and lock you out of your data. And that is indeed what often happens. So it's good that the NCSC is thinking about this, the National Cybersecurity Centre, and is trying to therefore minimise that risk, because I mean, the UK National Health Service is, at a time of crisis, virtually every year in its entire long 70-year history. So, if anything happens to a trust now, when, again, they're dealing with huge numbers of COVID admissions as well as trying to care for everyone else, if you then started to lose them through ransomware attacks, that really would be a terrible thing for all concerned. So good that the NCSC is looking at this, but also kind of terrible that you need to even say it in the first place. Please don't hack the hospital. Yeah,
it really is. Just sticking with that then, the NCSC have also just covered 2 more points. So the first one is about US authorities releasing new guidance in relation to securing VPNs. So this is an information sheet that's been released by the National Security Agency and the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency as well. And they set out the key factors for organisations to be considering and steps that they should be taking in order to harden a VPNs against compromise. So the NCSC are basically recommending that all organisations, both in the UK, the US, etc., familiarising themselves with the VPN guidance set out by the NSA, which offers some practical advice on how to choose and deploy and configure devices securely using VPNs.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I mean, this is an interesting bit of guidance. It's making the point that not all VPNs are equal. Some are better and more secure than others. And then it also is highlighting some of these issues with regards to configuration and with regards to making sure that networks are properly kept safe and secure. And of course, if a VPN isn't updated, or if it isn't quite as secure as certain other ones might be, it's a key risk. And I think it's actually, when you actually look at articles like this, these are the sorts of questions that I think senior management and boards need to think of, because very often, you know, they might have said, oh, well, we've got all of our team working from home because of the pandemic. Is it secure? And then from IT, they'll say, yes, we've got a VPN. And you go, oh, okay, that's all we need. And the line of questioning ends, when actually the next question should be, great, what security measures are in place on that VPN? Do we have encryption? Do we have something else? And I think it's really important to think about that, and that the VPN isn't necessarily the end in itself. The thing needs to be regularly updated, as all systems do. And it's a matter of thinking about that. So just because you've got a VPN doesn't mean you're out of the woods, doesn't mean that you are necessarily as secure as you could be. So really that should be then just the start of another whole conversation. And if the NSA and the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is looking at this, it's quite right that the UK National Cybersecurity Centre circulates the same information, and it's just a reminder to all organisations, public and private, large and small, to make sure that if you are still having widespread working from home and you are using a VPN, well, is it up to date? Is it the right model? Is it as secure as it could be? Are you using a premium VPN, or are you actually just using a free one that you managed to get online? That's kind of the lesson here, and it's actually sort of saying, yeah, think quite carefully about it. So timely guidance.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the final thing to touch on as well. So this is about attackers look to deploy attacks through the software supply chain. So this is a cloud services, basically saying that cloud services can be more secure than in-house solutions, but they aren't always without the flaws as well. So an unnamed software as a service provider actually invited a research group into their company, basically, to identify vulnerabilities in the supply chain. And the exercise basically uncovered that critical software development flaws leave customers potentially vulnerable to attacks as well. So it's just highlighting the risk when it comes to software as a service products like Amazon, AWS and everything like that as well.
Indeed. So the example that the researchers give here is where in the supply chain, you might have given an administrator a significant amount of control over a network, and then what if, you know, can you trust that administrator? Have they been compromised? Because if it turns out that you're giving that permission to someone that cannot necessarily be trusted, then what access could they have? What damage could they cause? And I think it's just showing that supply chains can indeed be compromised. Can you necessarily be sure that the person you've been in contact with hasn't changed at some point, and that you're providing access to a nefarious party with ill intentions? And it's just flagging up the fact that not everyone is necessarily sometimes who they might seem to be, particularly when, of course, during the course of the last 18 months, we may end up relying on suppliers that we've never actually met in person, and it's all been over video, or it might have just been through phone calls. And there's been that need for speed and urgency that means some of our usual security checks, even if it's just being able to meet someone face to face, has been circumvented due to business critical need, but that now might be an opportunity actually just to interrogate the integrity of that supply chain. I mean, let's face it, we're going to be having an autumn and winter of supply chain problems around the world due to the issues around economies coming back after COVID. And I'd say now is actually under the cover of saying, well, we need to check the integrity of and make sure our supply chain is sufficiently robust. You might also want to just check that all of the various people and organizations in that chain can be verified and the right levels of access have been given and no compromise has been undertaken. And it's again, I think, a very timely reminder here from the National Cybersecurity Centre.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was our last story for today. So we want to say a big thank you again to Anson Evaluate for helping us produce this webinar. So Anson Evaluate do have a lot of good guidance on their website, and they do some training as well, in person, online, through webinars, etc. as well. But they will be putting out some CPD courses over the next couple of weeks that Peter might be able to give us some more information about now.
Yes, so take a look at both Anson Evaluate on Twitter at Anson Evaluate, and also Digital Law at Digital Law, as well as on the websites digitallawuk.com and ansonevaluate.com for information on the continuing professional development courses, a series of online webinars that we will be running this autumn. We are currently finalising the first couple of those, and you'll be able to register online for those. So please do keep an eye on the websites and on our social media feeds for more information on that. And of course, we'll also be updating you regularly on our episodes here with more information on those courses as they come out.
Great, thanks, Peter. So yeah, big thank you to Anson Evaluate again, and for us listeners. So we'll be back next week with another episode, hopefully, or maybe the week after, depending on our availability. But just a reminder, these episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel, podcast channels as well, so Spotify, Apple Music. And yeah, that's about it. So thank you very much for listening, and we hope to see you again soon.